In this video, I will be explaining nonfiction narrative and primary and secondary sources. Let's start with defining narrative nonfiction. A nonfiction work, by definition, must be true. Thus, narrative nonfiction is prose writing that tells the stories of real people, places, objects, or events. So just know if you are reading a narrative nonfiction, you are reading a story that happened in real life to real people. There are different types of narrative accounts. So let's talk about the 6 here. First, we have a journal. A journal records daily events and personal observations. This might be something that you do already in your life. If you write down things that happen to you every day, then you are keeping a journal. Next, we have historical narrative. That records historical events that the writer may or may not have experienced firsthand. In other words, a historical narrative talks about events that happen in history that may or may not have directly happened to the person writing. Then we have slave narrative. That will be our focus for the next few weeks. A slave narrative records the writer's experience as a slave and may tell how he or she escaped or was freed. Next, we have autobiography. This is something that you are already familiar with since we just finished reading the excerpt from Zora Neale Hurston's autobiography, From Dust Tracks on a Road. That tells the author's life story. Next, we have memoirs. Those are first-person accounts of personal and historical events. They are a form of autobiography. And finally, we have exploration narrative. That records information about the writer's travels to an unfamiliar place. So let's just say that you traveled to somewhere that was new and different for you, and you wrote about the things that happened to you there, the people you met, the places you went to, the things that you experienced. Then you would be writing your own exploration narrative. Many narrative accounts are written in a distinctive style and tone. So let me go ahead and explain right now what style and tone mean. First, we have style. That is the writer's particular way of writing. It's made up of both syntax, which means word choice, and tone, and can be described as an author's voice. You're probably familiar with the word style because you might hear people talking about a person's individual style, maybe like the way that they dress or the way that they act. So that kind of style is very similar to a writer, but for a writer, it's the particular way that they write. There are 4 main examples of different types of style of writing. First, we have expository, which is a focus on a subject in the writing. Then we have persuasive, which is a focus on convincing someone of something in a writing. Then we have description, which is a focus on describing something. And then we have narrative, where the focus is on storytelling. Okay, then we have tone. Tone is the writer's attitude toward the audience and the subject. Tone in writing will be reflective of author's mood. If you've ever heard someone say, it's not what you said, but how you said it, then that is what they're talking about, is the tone. When someone is physically talking, you can kind of hear a tone or an attitude in their voice. But when you're reading something, you can notice a writer's tone in the different words that they choose. Okay, so here are just a few examples of different tones that could take place in a piece of writing. We have serious, humorous, threatening, reflective, critical, angry, disappointed, sad. Again, those are just a few examples. Here in the graphic, there are some examples of positive tone in writing and negative tone in writing. So with tone, just think about how something is said, but through words. Okay, now let's move on to primary and secondary sources. So now that we've talked about narrative nonfiction, that leads us into these types of sources. Narrative accounts may be classified as either first-hand or second-hand. First-hand accounts are considered primary sources, and second-hand accounts are considered secondary sources. These might be terms that you're familiar with because you may have heard them in history class. When we use these terms, we usually talk about documents that are used in historical contexts, but they can also be referred to in literary contexts as well. So first, let's focus on primary sources. So what is a primary source? One way you can think of it is it's a first-hand account of a historical event, and for primary sources are created during the time that the event took place, and they're created by people who actually lived through the event. Okay. They can be created retrospectively. That means after the event took place, but it has to be by somebody who actually was there to experience, someone with firsthand knowledge. Okay, so let me go ahead and read that definition again. Primary sources are firsthand accounts of a historical event and are created during the time that event took place by people who lived through the event. They can also be created retrospectively at a later date by a participant who took place in the event, someone with firsthand knowledge. So let me give you an example of this that you could probably understand. Right now, we are going through a very significant event in history. We are going through the coronavirus pandemic. So if you were to create something that was reflective of what was happening in society right now, that could be anything from a letter, a painting, some kind of document, maybe you're writing a diary. But if you were to be creating that now as you're going through it, and then someone were to reference that years down the line, what you created would be considered a primary source because you are creating it right now during the time that it's happening. We are currently in the pandemic, and you actually lived through the event. You are personally experiencing it. That's what it means when someone has firsthand knowledge. It means that they actually personally went through in it and experienced it themselves. They're not hearing about it from someone else. They are actually personally experiencing it themselves. That's what it means with the firsthand, is that you have direct knowledge of it. There's an idiom that you may have heard of, but maybe you never knew what it meant, that really lends itself to the idea of primary sources. And the idiom is straight from the horse's mouth. And what that means is to hear about something from a person who has direct knowledge about it. It's not like I heard it from a friend who heard it from their cousin, who heard it from another friend. You're actually hearing it from someone who directly experienced it themselves. Okay, so that's what straight from the horse's mouth means, and that's what a primary source is. Okay, so let's look at some examples of primary sources. There's lots. We've got notes, letters, newspaper articles, autobiographies, maps, government records, diaries, memoirs, speeches, objects. Objects could be lots of things, like anything like clothes, tools, coins, toys, pottery. I mean, tons of things. Anything that's an object. Images, anything visual like paintings, photographs, drawings, posters, tapestries. Recordings, anything audio recorded like interviews, TV shows, radio programs. Okay, so going back to the example that I gave you about right now, we're all going through a historical event, the pandemic due to the coronavirus. Let's say that there was an interview on TV with someone about it, maybe some expert. And then years down the line, someone were to watch that, that would be considered a primary source. Okay, so again, it's created during the historical event itself by someone who actually experienced it. Or it could be created later after the event, but it has to be by somebody who experienced it personally. Okay. Here are some examples. So even though this is a picture of a newspaper, not the actual newspaper itself, the actual newspaper itself is considered a primary source. And again, even though it's a picture of it, we're still talking about the newspaper itself. This is from November 22nd, 1963. And in this newspaper, it talks about President Kennedy being assassinated. Okay, that's considered a primary source because the newspaper was published during that time that happened. Okay, and here's another example. This is a photograph of a speech, a very famous speech by Martin Luther King Jr. His I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., August 28, 1963. That speech, the I Have a Dream speech, is considered a primary source. Okay, now there are some positives and negatives when we talk about referencing primary sources. One of the positive is that it is written by someone who actually participated or was an eyewitness who experienced the event directly. So they have direct knowledge of the event. So let's just say, for example, you were to talk to somebody who actually was here during 1963 at this speech, witnessed it directly, was really there, then that interview with that person would be considered a primary source because that person actually was there at that time. So that's a positive thing because it's always better to get information from somebody who experienced it directly because they have like inside knowledge that someone who did not experience it directly does not have. But there could be negatives or drawbacks as well. So some of the negatives of primary sources is that it may be subjective or even biased, meaning that that person writing it might have their own one-sided perspective or their own personal slant. They have bias because it's from their own point of view. However, like let's say they have a negative point of view about it, then that's what's going to come off. Okay, so that could be a negative. Also, it could only contain the information the writer happens to know. Again, because it's from that one person's perspective or point of view, it's only what that writer happens to know. Okay, so now that we've covered primary sources, let's move on to secondary sources. Secondary sources are secondhand accounts of a historical event and are written after the event. Okay, so it's written at a later time, not during the event itself, by people who researched the event but did not directly witness or experience it. They are at least one step removed from what they are describing. Okay, so again, back to the example I gave you of the coronavirus pandemic. Let's just say in a decade, 10 years from now, someone who actually, let's just say maybe 50 years from now, someone who did not actually live through, so someone younger who did not actually live through the coronavirus pandemic that we're in right now, is doing some research and writing about the event, but they were not actually alive when it happened, and did not actually go through it and know what it was like to live in our society during the pandemic. But they're writing about it. That would be considered a secondary source, okay? Because they are removed from it. They didn't actually go through it. Secondary or secondhand, those are terms you might be familiar with, things in kind of our everyday life. If you go to a store and buy secondhand clothes, those are clothes that are from somebody else. It's not like you had them originally and directly, right? Somebody else had them and then now you're buying them. They're secondhand. Or we have secondhand smoke, right? You're not actually smoking yourself, but you're getting that through somebody else who smokes. You're one step removed from that smoke, but you're still kind of experiencing it yourself. So those are just a couple of everyday examples that might help you understand a little bit better what secondhand means. So let me just go ahead and read through that definition one more time before I move on. Secondary sources are secondhand accounts of a historical event and are written after the event by people who researched the event but did not directly witness or experience the event. They are at least one step removed from what they are describing. Okay, so here are some examples of secondary sources. We have books, biographies, articles, websites, documentary films, classroom textbooks, magazines, encyclopedias, and dissertations. So let's look at some specific examples. Here on the left, we have an encyclopedia. Looks like it's volume 1 to 1877. Talks about some historical events, but these were written later by researchers, scholars, academics, talking about the past from information that they researched, but they didn't actually live through it themselves. And then here on the right, we have an example of a film about the Civil War in Gettysburg. Again, these are actors. They didn't actually live through that time. But it's just a film that references that historical event. Okay? So these are examples of secondary sources. Like primary sources, there are positives and negatives. A positive of a secondary source is that secondary sources are more likely to be objective than first-hand accounts and to contain more complete information. Because the person writing it or creating it did not experience it firsthand, they don't have that personal bias. So they're more likely to include information from all perspectives or all points of view. Again, it's not just about what they personally experienced, so they're going to be more complete and thorough. So that's a positive of secondary sources. But there are some negatives. The negatives of this should say secondary sources. Fix that. Is they lack the insight gained from someone who lived through the experience directly. Because it's secondary, we know that they didn't go through it themselves, so they might not have some insight from someone who was actually there. Again, back to the coronavirus pandemic example. We're all living through it right now. We have personal inside information, knowing what it's like, but someone who is writing about it decades from now, who didn't actually experience it, they're not going to have that real personal inside knowledge. And then also, since they are written after that event, it might not be as impactful because it's written later on. And then here are some examples that compare a similar topic, but show you how it could be a primary versus a secondary source. Okay, so here at the top we have a portrait of Queen Elizabeth painted when she was a child. That would be a primary source, okay, because it was painted of her when she actually was that age. Okay, it was happening while the event was actually taking place. Then we have a drawing of Queen Elizabeth, so the same person, but this was drawn later, way later, in 2005. And as you can see, it's just a drawing of her. It's not her actual real life in person. Okay, so hopefully this video helped clarify for you the difference between primary and secondary sources and narrative nonfiction. Thanks for watching. Bye.